The Art Dealer Diaries are brought to you by Medicine Man Gallery, located for over 26 years in Tucson, Arizona, specializing in antique Native American art, early Western art, including the famed Maynard Dixon, as well as modern art. You can find everything online at medicinemangallery.com. There's over 6,000 objects to select from. Also, the Charles Bloom Murder Mystery Series, written by yours truly, me, Mark Sublette. There's 6 books in this series, and they follow the protagonist Charles Bloom through all the intrigue of the art world set in Santa Fe and the Navajo Nation. These can be found on Audible, eBooks, Amazon, and of course, the gallery at medicinemangallery.com. I got to interview Bob Gallegos today, and Bob is a longtime Native American art dealer. He is native New Mexican. In fact, he's part Navajo, which I didn't even realize. He's been in the business as long as anyone. This is a really interesting podcast because we talked about not only his life and where he started and how he got into the business, but market trends that are going on today, and also 2 big collections that he handled. In fact, one of them sold for $1.2 million, which was very interesting, and I'd always kind of wanted to hear the backstory on that. So this will be a podcast for any of you people out there who want to kind of understand the Indian art market as it is today, as well as where it began with Bob Gallegos. Wow, I'm here with Bob Gallegos. Bob, I've known you for as long as I've been in the business, and you're way ahead of me in that field too.
Yes, started in 1972.
So you started in 72. And that was, well, let's just start beginning. I want to go deep in with Bob Gallegos, and we'll just give you a little history. Bob is one of the shakers and leaders in our community, the antique Indian art world, as well as Atata. And so we kind of all look toward Bob or have for advice, and he knows jewelry pottery, he knows a lot of stuff. Smart guy, and thrilled to have him on. But where did you begin? My understanding is you grew up, well, you didn't grow up, but you were born in Chimayo, is that right?
That's correct. Then moved to Albuquerque when I was about 2 years old. My dad went to UNM, and I followed in his steps, graduated from UNM, which is the University of New Mexico, probably in 1969.
You graduated in 59?
69.
Oh, I was going to say, oh my God.
Yeah, no, I'm not
You're
that
really
old.
looking very good, Bob. So you graduated in 69, which was the height of the Vietnam War, actually.
That's right. And I went to work for a bank in 1969.
So let me back up and ask you about your dad. Now, your dad was from Chimayo, and your mom was from, your dad was from Santa Fe and your mom was from Chimayo?
Correct.
And were her family, had they been in northern New Mexico for a very long time? Were they weavers? Because Chimayo, of course, is known so well for that.
My great-grandmother was full-blooded Navajo.
Again, I did not know this. Yeah.
And she used to cart the wool for my uncles to do the Rio Grande weavings back in the 1880s to 1900.
And that was your great-grandmother?
My great-grandmother.
And was she one of those so-called slave blanket weavers, that she had ended up in a Hispanic family from that, or do you know?
She didn't weave. She just knew how to cart wool. And
but how did she end up in that community? Do you know?
My grandfather married her.
Yeah.
My great-grandfather married her.
Interesting.
And back in the day, there was a lot of, after we got through the rough periods of conquest and changing over to religions, the Spanish communities and the Indian communities really needed each other to get through hard times, because it was a harsh environment. And so there was a lot of intermarriage, and there was a lot of trading, and that's how I had a Navajo grandmother.
And so she carted for the blankets that were woven in Chimayo. And so and then somehow your dad and mom met. How did that happen?
They met at Manal High School.
So in Santa Fe.
That's in Albuquerque.
I mean Albuquerque. Sorry.
It's a Presbyterian.
Albuquerque. I should have known
Presbyterian-run school, and they both graduated like in the 40s, early 40s.
And then what did your dad do?
He was a number of things, but he ended up as an agent for the IRS, And then after he retired, he opened up his own accounting firm. Office, just a one-man office.
And so when you were growing up as a kid, primarily in Albuquerque, right? Were you exposed to Native or Hispanic arts at that time? Did they
No.
collect it? No.
No.
Did you have an interest in anything in collecting when you were a little kid?
Although I moved to Albuquerque when I was 2, I went back to Chimayo and spent the summers with my grandparents until I was about 14. And in Chimayo, there was a lot of places to look for arrowheads. And so I started looking for arrowheads, and that's where my interest started to fester a little bit. And then I married. My wife and I married young in high school, and her mother was a school teacher, and her mother would go out on the weekends and trade with the Santo Domingan Indians, or the folks from Cochiti or other pueblos. One
Trade
day,
for like food and things for pottery and jewelry and things like that?
yeah. And she asked me one day, well, you like arrowheads. What more of a natural place to get arrowheads is the Indian community. And I thought, well, that makes sense. So I went out and I bought all my trade materials, sets of Melmac dishes, baby clothes, bed linens, and I was going out there
To Santo Domingo, Pueblo.
to trade for arrowheads. Well, when I showed the arrowheads to the natives, they said, well, we need those. We would like to have them ourselves. So no arrowheads that day, traded for a bunch of baskets, Navajo wedding baskets. Back in the day, they were selling for $15 retail each.
And what day was that? What year would that have been?
That would have been like 1968,
68. So you're a junior in high school at that point?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I was in college. Yeah,
Okay.
Junior in college.
Okay.
And,
That's right, because you graduated from college in 1969. Yeah, because I want to get to that here shortly. But so you were trading, you were in college, you were doing this trading.
Started working for the bank in 71.
But that was the impetus. When you started doing those baskets and selling them you traded and selling them for $15, that's when you were kind of starting as a trader. Would you say that's right?
That's right.
And you're in college at this point.
I'm in college. That first trip to the Santo Domingo Pueblo with my mother-in-law, I did the 360-degree experience. I traded for things traded for baskets. I didn't want the baskets. I went to the Domingo Trading Post, and I saw that they had $15 a piece on their baskets. So I took my baskets and I said, will you give me $15 in trade, and I'll trade against these arrowheads? And the arrowheads were like $1 a piece. So I got like 200 and some arrowheads. On the way home, I stopped in Jimmy Silva's at Bernalillo, and he had the same arrowheads. And he said, Bob, I said, I hope you didn't pay too much for these, because they're not real. I said, I have them here for 50 cents.
That are real?
That are not real.
Oh, that are not real.
Same arrowhead.
Oh, same exact arrowhead.
So I saw my $20 investment traded for $60 worth of real baskets, traded those real baskets off, and ended up with $10 of fake arrowheads. And I said, so that's the way this works.
Lesson number 1.
Yeah, well, that's right, most important lesson. And after that, I started trading every weekend, to the point that 4 years into my banking career, the bank was just getting in the way.
Yeah. And so when you graduate from college, Vietnam is raging. How did you avoid going in, or did you, to the war? Did you get a high draft number? Or?
I was exempt because I had a child. My wife and I married rather young, and we had a child, and we were always kind of like 6 months ahead of all those changes in your status.
Right.
And so
you didn't have to go through that,
No,
though all your counterparts were doing it, and
That's right.
one way or another. And so something very important happened in that time frame in the late 60s, early 70s, and your timing was perfect, which was the Indian craze for jewelry. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what was going on in the late 60s with squash blossoms and everything else.
it was probably 1972 to 4 where we saw such a craze. And that was a perfect time for us to get into the business because you didn't have to know anything. Everything was selling. We had no money. There would be times when I would spend my money in Zuni and I'd get like to Winslow and I'd have to turn around because I was out of merchandise, because not only did the stores need it, but the gas stations had counters full of it. It was just an amazing time to be in business. And some of the ugliest things got made at that time because everything was selling. And luckily, in 1980, by 1978, that ugly jewelry wasn't selling anymore, and a lot of us were holding on to it.
Right.
But because of the Hunt brothers, they drove silver to $50 an ounce. We were able to melt all our stuff and make a little bit of money.
So all the things that you had bought, which were probably lesser quality, got
Yes.
repurposed, so to speak.
Right.
And then they probably, once the Hunt brothers crashed the market, which had happened not after that, long after that, the Native Americans would probably went and bought back the silver at a cheaper price once it hit back the market, which I'm sure it did.
Yeah.
So in that time frame, so you work from 69 for about 4 years to 73, you're working as a bank teller. And what was your degree in college?
Finance and economics.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then you realize, I can do this. You've been trading all along anyway at Santo Domingo, so you understand the buying and selling aspect at this point. And so at that, the Indian world just kind of explodes. And for those who are too young to remember it, and I remember it because everybody, even though I was in like junior high at this time, I was dealing in Indian jewelry as well, because it was just, everybody had to have it. I mean, you had to have squash blossoms, bracelets, all the concho belts. You go to see any great big rock star, show, The Who, you're going to see concho belts and all that. So everybody was following the trends, which is kind of coming back around. So you would go to Zuni, pick up whatever jewelry you could from the silversmiths, take it, and before you could even get back to Albuquerque, it was sold, and you'd have to try to figure out another way to get the jewelry?
Oh, yeah. Normally I'd take these trips to California, but in the first trips I was taking, I'd have to turn down and back in Winslow, go back to Zuni and, rebuy whatever I could and then head out to California again.
And was that where you'd get most of the jewelry? You didn't go up to the Navajo Nation?
No, actually, I took a lot of my jewelry on consignment from a larger dealer, and I made like half of the profit, out of which I had to pay all my expenses. And it worked out quite well, but then I realized that if I owned it, I'd make it all.
You get the whole profit.
That's right.
So you have to find the silversmiths.
And so, there were also people that did that for you, like tourneys. They would have a large inventory. They'd be very reasonable. They charge you 10% if you bought X amount.
Like jobbers type thing?
Like jobbers.
And tell people what a jobber is, because most people won't even know what the heck that is.
A jobber is someone that sells to dealers on the road. So if something is worth $15, a jobber buys it for $5, sells it for $7.50 to a retail. The retail marks it up $15. And some people think that might be excessive markup from $5, but when you think about how everything's marketed, clothing has sometimes 5 to 6 times markup. So it's.
And does the jobber world still exist in your mind?
Yeah, it still does.
It's still going on. The internet hasn't somehow thrown out the middleman yet.
It's doing a good job of changing the dynamics, but yes, you still have opportunity to buy unusual things at jobbers that the internet won't have.
So in this time frame, so you'd go to California if you could. Now you were doing it on your own. And how did you get the silversmiths once this dealer was no longer providing you? Where would you go then?
Well, I wasn't like contemporary jewelry started me out mostly on consignment, and then a few silversmiths and a few fetish carvers from Zuni. But I always had a small amount of knowledge about the older material. And where I changed direction is when I was doing these road trips, I would see a lot of old material that most people were at that time recycling, but they would much rather have new jewelry.
The new stuff. So you were looking at the old jewelry, just jewelry, not anything else, not pottery or anything else.
I was looking at all the older crafts.
Everything.
Because I already had a pretty good basis of knowledge of that. So what I soon learned is I would take a lot of jewelry on the road. I didn't want to sell it. I wanted to trade retail for the old material. Often the old material was underpriced in my mind, and I'm pretty conservative, so it probably was. And so when I traded for it, if they had $15 on it, I got into it for $5, and I'd mark it up to $30. And that's where I was able to get ahead, get some capital, start buying my own little collections, and this was how I operated for probably until about 1978 to 80.
And at that time, were there other competitors that were starting to do that, buy old jewelry, old material?
Oh yeah, there's when I started, I would say in the late 60s, that old material was being sold mostly by established people like Rex Arrowsmith, Nita and Don Hole in Sedona. A lot of these old-time families, Forrest Finn hadn't started yet.
Right.
You had Bill Dutton of Rare Things. He started back in the 50s here. People like Eleanor Badal. She died in the 70s, so I'm not sure about that date, but she used to have a store in the 50s and 60s in Santa Fe. So that's how it was being marketed. And
so a select group of people, not a lot of people. And did any of those guys or women mentor you at all? Were they?
Sure.
Yeah. Was there one or two in particular that really kind of helped you get on your path?
I had, my mentors were, Jimmy Silva of Bernalillo, Rex Arrowsmith, even C.G.Wallace. He gave me my first stuff on consignment in 1967 when he had that store in De Anza.
And how old would he have been at that time?
Oh, he was probably in his 60s. I was like 17.
Because he came out about 1919, I think, when his first store was.
Yeah. He lived until he was 91. But I went into C.G.'s store one day, and I didn't know who C.G. was, but he had some nice things. And I was talking to him. He was in the store, and he says, you like this stuff? And I said, I like it. And I said, I think I could sell some of these pieces, but I just don't have any money. And he says, well, you don't need money here, son. Take what you want. So I took about 5 or 6 pieces, and I said, well, let me sign a receipt. He says, are you going to forget what you took from him? And I said, no. I said, well, I won't forget it either. We don't need a receipt. You just get me this amount for him. So I did that about 4 or 5 times. And then he disappeared from my life for about 30 years, and then I reconnected with him when he was about 80 years old. And there's other stories I have about C.G. Wallace after that.
Did he remember you when you...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
He knew who I was.
He was quite the entrepreneur, really.
Yeah, he was loved and hated, but he did a lot of good.
Yeah, and who loved him?
It could be the natives, non-natives. It just depends on which end of the handshake you were on, or which end of the deal you were on. So.
Yeah. So it was both. The love and hate came from both groups at all times, depending on how a deal might have gone down.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, so Wallace was one of your mentors. Who else would have been in that group?
Well, Rex Arrowsmith was
he
pretty
was
important. Yeah. But one of the pickers of Albuquerque, his name was Tony Garcia. He outfitted he sold things to Larry Frank. He sold things to Dr. Mengi that has that, the Corrales, the Museum of Albuquerque bought his Corrales home with all the furnishings, and a lot of those furnishings came from Tony. And Tony lived 102, and I started dealing with Tony in the 70s, and he taught me a lot.
And did he have a store, or did he just a picker?
He was just a picker.
Yeah, we say that, but they're so important to our business.
Yeah.
You know, that without that group of people, scouts, pickers, people that are out there finding it, it makes our job a lot harder. And they're on the front lines often.
Right.
They're hitting every swap meet, every garage sale, doing wherever it is. And then, of course, that world has changed dramatically too, because you have the internet. Everything's out there. They just cut out the middleman, which sometimes the pickers are. You see the show American Pickers, and you watch how it is, and some of it's kind of like that, and a lot of it's not near as glamorous.
No, I think the most fun I had was when I used to go into the native communities and we do these trades. And I have to tell you, talking about mentors, the San Domingans are the best traders ever.
Yeah, I've heard that many times from many people.
And I learned a lot about trading from them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, those Navajo baskets that you got, they traded for them somehow as well.
Yes.
And they're known for their jewelry. They're fantastic silversmiths, but they are known as really quite adroit traders. And we've all been on the wrong end of a deal, I'm sure, at one point or another, and they just are laughing. But, that's when you have to survive by your wits, you get very good at it. And if you're making jewelry and selling jewelry, that's not an easy way to go either. I think our jobs are a lot easier finding it and selling it. And so when the 70s crashed in about, as far as the jewelry like it was in 75, at that point were you already pretty much doing the older material?
Yes.
So you had already transitioned, and you're now looking and buying older material, and you're one of a handful that are really kind of doing that. Yes. And you're situated out of Albuquerque. And so take me from what happened at that point on.
1980 was kind of the date that I was doing mostly vintage or antique material. And there were certain hot spots, and of course, the hot spot was in Scottsdale. And that lasted probably 20 years. But I would not need material. All I would need is to fill up my gas and have enough room for lodging. And I could walk from one gallery and get it on consignment and take it down the street and do that for a week and made very good wages. Because there was so much material, there was so much interest, so many galleries that a lot of them were too busy to shop amongst themselves. You had people like Elaine Horowitz. You had Gallery 10, who was Lee Cohen.
Lee Cohen, yeah.
Who bought Bob Ashton out. You had the Clevelands. You had so many galleries. And it was just a wonderful time. And
those galleries were dealing in Western art and Native American art, and this would have been an old town. And so you would literally go from one store to the other, say, I can sell that for you, and you take it over down the street to another gallery that could use it, that and say, here you go, I'll sell this to you, and then you just walk back over and write them a check.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was an amazing time.
Yeah, and that lasted for about to the early 90s, or even a little longer, really. I look at it being mid to late 90s.
I think 90s. I think the 80s were the best.
The heyday.
I mean, but it was only the dealers. It was the collectors. It was, my hat's off to Dennis Lyon, because he was probably the one person that created more interest in the material other than Marty Striever. And he got so many of his friends involved, and they had no idea of the material, but he was such
He was a force.
He was so emotional and passionate about it that
Yeah.
before they know it, all these people were collecting it. And it didn't last. You know, it was like 5 years, and then they moved on to something else.
Yeah, and Dennis had Lyons Realty, great collector, loved pottery, loved everything really, loves, I should say. And he and his wife Janice are fantastic collectors, both have wonderful eyes. And you're right, they're super passionate. I've sold things to Dennis and Janice, and he loved the material, no doubt. So, and so you saw a change starting in the early 90s that was more competitive maybe that was part of the reason that it seemed like it wasn't as good. There was more people coming into the business. I came in 1992 officially.
I would say that things started to peak around 1993, 4.
So I got in just at the tail end of your peaking.
Yeah,
That's because I came into the market.
I remember my wife Cindy and I collected historic pottery, and we had a pretty nice collection. And I went back to Sotheby's in 1989, and there was one pot I needed to have, and I was just going to buy it. And I didn't come home with it because it got up to like $18,000, and that was just, you know, I should have dropped out at 10 because I couldn't afford the 18.
What was the pot?
It was a very nice 4-color Acoma jar from the 1880s.
With parrots, probably.
Yes. And so I came home, and so I told Cindy, we didn't get the pottery jar, but it went for this. And you know, we have like 60 of these pots. And so as a coincidence, and as luck would have it, Morningstar Gallery is purchased by
Manugian, right?
Well, actually, Morningstar Gallery purchased the gallery from Manugian.
I see.
And they needed a splash. And unsolicited, Mac Grimmer gave me a call and says, would you consider selling your collection? And so my wife was in the room, and I said, well, honey, what do you think? And she says, no, of course not. And I said, well, let me put it in terms of numbers. And I said, this collection is worth $1.5 million if you extrapolate that last price that was achieved at Sotheby's. And they're probably willing to pay $1 million for it. We hadn't even talked. So I looked at Mac, and Mac says, $1 million? And I said, I think that's what we want for it, Mac. And but I'll make it easier for you. I said, I will retain 1/3 of the collection, interest in it. So that means all expenses to promote it, I will put up 1/3, which was the book and a lot of other things. But I'm in it for 1/3 of the retail too. And so what that meant is instead of $1 million for the collection, it ended up a little under 1.2 million. But it took 5 years. But it was worth the wait.
Yeah.
So that obviously changed our lives a lot in how we operated and things like that.
Gave you capital.
Gave us capital.
And so what year was that?
1990. They had the sale in 1991.
Yeah. So yeah, it sounds right.
Yeah.
Because I remember that sale. I was still practicing medicine and was kind of buying and selling on the side, developing and I loved pottery. I always loved pottery growing up in New Mexico. And I remember looking at those pots and thinking, oh my God, these are the most magnificent pots. And then seeing the prices and saying, oh my. And there was a couple that I really wanted, and there was no way that I could justify, or not only justify, come up with the money to buy one of those. And they were all selling, and I was like, oh my, this is really, who is this Bob Gallegos guy?
Well, believe it or not, it was by 1996 or 7 that the prices of pottery started going down because they just went up too fast, and some of the key people dropped out and they weren't supporting the market anymore. And well, the prices today are just another story, you know.
Yeah. So, but they came down for a while, I would say, and probably part of that was that you had taken out a lot of the players. They'd filled their coffers. Everyone else probably tried to match those prices. Immediately when they see a jar's selling for $5,000 that they had $2,000 on, they say, well, mine's worth $6,000. And so I'm sure that had a shakeout. But the price of pottery at some point did continue to go up, because I can remember Morningstar having a sale of these big, huge, historic pots, these storage vessels, early Cochiti.
Actually,
that were in the $300,000-$400,000 range, I think.
that's true. And but I think that ended pretty close to 2,000. I mean, there's still some pots being offered, but it's not in that price range anymore.
And why do you think that is?
Well,
There's less pots probably in some respects. A lot of them ended up in collections, museum collections.
I'll probably be repeating myself a little bit. I was interviewed by the Albuquerque Journal on why prices might be going down, but it's just the changing demographics in our business, and there's just not enough young people interested in the same material that you and I were. Their interests are maybe more abstract, more contemporary, whatever the reason. It's not that the disposable income's not there, it's just that the interest has shifted.
Right. And I think in some respects, if you're a beginning collector, you're very fortunate because you can get the price structure is much different than it was, let's say, in 2000. It's less. And the same pots that you might have gone after for an $18,000 at Sotheby's could be as little as half that, maybe even, I would say. Would that be fair to say?
It could be fair to say. But even at half that, if you don't have any background, $9,000 is still a lot of money. So where our industry has failed itself is that we haven't kept relative to the younger people. We relied on old ways of advertising, and quite honestly, that doesn't work.
That's why we're sitting here on a podcast, one of the reasons.
Right. I
will say, though, and I think this is true, and I think you'll probably collaborate this, if you have a great piece, and we're talking about the upper 1% kind of thing, it still demands probably the same or maybe higher prices than it did before, because everyone in the real serious collectors are still chasing those 10s that are the best. Do you think that's a true statement?
Oh yeah, I think, wasn't it Moran's that sold that first phase blanket for $1.2 million? And
1.8.
So what was the previous high? It was well under $1 million.
Yeah, and that wasn't that long ago. Yeah, I think the great stuff will break records, whether this is Native American art or tribal art. There was a big Hawaiian piece that recently sold for millions. So I think it has become more of a fragmented market, that the lower end, less important works, common works, bring a fraction of what they did. The higher, the best stuff is still quite desirable. I know maybe I'm the odd man out, but I'm still willing to pay a very high number for something that's fantastic.
And having said that, though, even that market is getting a little thinner. Institutions is another market that people shouldn't forget about, because they need to fill holes in their collections. But none of us really think about institutions because it's a long process and they have to have it approved. But I'm just putting that out there. Don't forget about them.
It's true. And, we have sold things to institutions, and they're clearly still collecting. The problem is, again, a lot of them don't. They'd rather wait till somebody gives them something than buy it. But they do buy, and they will buy. And so after you made your $1.2 million, and that's right around let's call it 2000, I guess that's right. Mm-hmm. What did you do then? How did you change the way you practiced your profession?
Well, I was just able to get better prices on larger collections. I was able to buy collections.
Big collections.
Yeah, bigger collections that I was used to. And then I put a lot of it back into art.
And you
Native
built
America.
collections too. Like
Yeah.
you also built an extremely important collection that was part of the Wheelwright show for the Cochiti storyteller figurines, pre-storytellers. Maybe you could talk a little bit about those, because I still find those absolutely fascinating. I love them, and they're super rare, right?
They are rare. They're an expression of an associate of mine made a statement that kind of stuck with me. It was a subordinate group that was empowered through humor. They made fun of the outside world, and they had the last laugh. And that's actually a pretty good way of looking at it. A lot of it was made strictly for tourism and, replenish that pseudo-religious look through a local production. A lot of that stuff was coming up from the Camino Real, Aztec material, Mayan material. And so those godlike feather figures were replaced by this kind of production. You had this happening in Tusuki with some of their figures.
The rain gods is
The
what you're
rain
thinking
gods.
about, primarily, which were also sold with candy.
Yeah, that's right. They came in a, I think, Cracker Jack box. And
And these figures, just so people will know, are large. Some of these, well, they can be small too, but they would be as large as maybe 25 or even 30 inches tall.
the largest I had was 30.5 inches.
Yeah, and so you're talking, so we often will call them opera singers. They're kind of humorous looking figurines that tell a story, and maybe a story that a lot of people could relate to. And so you started collecting these, you saw the rarity and got the sense of humor, and you put together an amazing collection, right?
Yeah, and to give an idea of how rare they are, I had the largest collection for a while, and I had 33.
That is a lot. I've had 4
Yeah.
big ones, and that's it.
But when you think about the total classification, and you only were able to get 33 of them, they are rare.
Yeah.
They are.
And I would imagine that for the first 5 years you collected it, no one knew you were collecting them.
I don't know if I was that smart. I think.
Oh yeah, you are.
I just had the. I probably went out and put out the word I was looking for these because they weren't bringing much money. So I thought, I better get them when I can. And
what drew you into them? Was it the imagery, or was it an opportunity? What did you see as the reason to put this group together?
I think it was. I had a lot of friends in Cochiti, and I went to a museum one time and I saw these big figurines, and I said, I wonder if my friends know about these things in Cochiti. Potters. And so I started collecting a few about the time Rick Dillingham was still with us and Dick Howard was still with us. And we were all contemporary pottery buyers at the same time, like in the late 70s, mid 80s. And so I would take these old figurines out to the Pueblo so they could replicate them and show them and teach them. And actually Virgil Ortiz, the great contemporary potter today and clothing designer, he came to my home when he was about 16 or 17, somewhere like that. And I showed him these figurines, and he was amazed by them, but he was amazed not so much from the subject matter, but from the form and how big they were, and they balanced. They didn't need stands. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's why a lot of them had big stomachs, so they could...
Big feet, too.
Huge feet,
yeah.
So they get more, balance. And I said, Virgil, the only difference between you and your ancestors is 100 years.
That's right.
And I said, you're making these exactly the same way your ancestors did. You're firing them the same way.
Was he making stuff at that time?
Yes, he was making storytellers. I first met him when he was like 6 years old, and he made little dinosaurs, and I used to buy some of those. So I said, but Virgil, I said, you can make these things. And I said, whatever you make, I will buy it, I promise you. And so about 3 months later, he comes in with about an 18-inch or 20-inch figure that is a S&M. And it's anatomically correct. It's a beautiful male face. I don't know how he did it. And he wanted like $1,500 for it. And I thought to myself, well, you're going to eat your words on this one. And I said, well, I said, Virgil, I said I'd buy it. I said, what was your influence? He says, oh, I read the Madonna book. And I said, well, you know, that's perfect because you're a young Cochiti man and you're influenced the way you're influenced.
Yeah.
And 100 years earlier, they had other influences. So I put it in my collection for a while, and I was just thinking, I'd probably have this one for a while. I'm not going to be able to sell it because most of my customers were gray-haired at the time, and they didn't appreciate that.
The male autonomy and the
That's right.
S&M or the Madonna reference.
Yeah. And so I held on to it, and for about 2 years, a person came up to me and asked, would you like to sell that? And I thought, well, at one time I would have, but I realized how important this piece is. This piece marked the recreation of these figurines, but from a contemporary influence. And it's a very important piece, and I'm just happy with it now.
And so you still have it?
No, I don't. I finally sold it about 4 or 5 years ago, but I had it for probably 20 years.
I'm assuming you did better than $1,500?
Yeah, I did it substantially better.
Well, he is such an important person.
Yeah.
I mean, the other person we think about for these is Helen Cordero, who started in '64, and her impetus was also Alexander Gerard, who's saying, yeah, these are very interesting. He bought them, my understanding, is in Santo Domingo, Pueblo, where she was showing, and encouraged her. So you have Alexander Gerard encouraging Helen Cordero to do her thing, and Bob Gallegos encouraging Virgil Ortiz to take a different look and a different step. So, you know, I think it's important to realize that collectors and dealers affect how markets change as well. And clearly, I had never known this story, a very interesting story with Virgil's work.
And one of the things with Virgil, though, is that he's kept his roots in the Pueblo. And so that makes a big difference with how things turn out. And he hasn't abandoned any of the traditional aspects. He kind of incorporates in there, but he does it in a contemporary way.
Yeah, very contemporary. He's had major museum shows throughout the country, maybe the world for all I know, probably has. And so you collect all this beautiful pottery, and at some point in time, then the Wheelwright has a show, right? And I assume a lot of those were from your collection at that point, or maybe all of them.
Correct.
And then at some point you said, okay, I'm going to sell these. And so what happened there?
Well, I just, we did a book. It was called Clay People.
Great book, by the way. I love that book.
And it incorporated not only the historic, but also the contemporary figurative people and sculptural people. And so they're hard to find, so I just figured that road has come to an end. And I had someone that was showing an interest in wanting them. And so I sold them a couple, and before I knew it, I probably sold them 90% of the rest.
Yeah. Well, it's great if you have the capital to buy a huge collection that somebody's put together. Quite frankly, that's a great thing to do. It's, you might think, oh, wow, I'm paying too much. But in the reality, think of the time, effort, energy
that
takes to put together. I think it's actually smarter if you can buy a collection that's already put together and vetted by somebody who's knowledgeable and understands the market. You've taken all the risk out, quite frankly, and now you have, especially in a field like that, which there are very few of them, you have basically the market.
And that's a good point, Mark, because anything that has value is going to be reproduced. And then some people will put it out there in a devious manner, and they'll try to call it an original. So your comment's well taken. It's the collection was vetted.
Very well
Yeah,
vetted.
right.
Yeah, you probably knew about as much on those
Yeah.
clay people as anybody in the world. Maybe Jonathan Beck and the Wheelwright might have been as up there with you, but that's what he does too.
Actually, he and I collaborated on that book.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah.
Clay people. That's one people need to add to their library if they haven't. And Bob sold all his figurines now, so you'll have to go find your own.
But it's been a MO of mine that I'll move out of that collection, then I'll start something else. Like we also did a book on the Ering Books,
Yeah.
and that took me a long time to put together. But I've also had collections of Strike-A-Light bags early on, and I had collections of Apache baskets. A New Mexican religious.
Yeah, and that's another
collection.
field that's
Yeah.
really kind of your strong suit is
Yeah.
Bultos and Retablos of early New Mexico saints, which of course seems a perfect mix from you, coming a kid from Chimayo and a long history of Spanish heritage. So you're still actively collecting and dealing with those pieces?
I limit myself now to what I collect. And New Mexican religious material and furniture I still do. And some old historic Native American jewelry. And New Mexican ephemera. I start to think about it. There's a few other collections I do as well. I collect like whiskey jugs from New Mexico.
Well, one thing you collect, which I didn't know, which I found fascinating, was early rocket ship toys too, right?
I had probably one of the top 5 collections in the United States. But I sold, I kept 15% of it and I sold the other 85% about 3 years ago.
And that market's changed a little too, right? The toy market's gone down as well.
It's gone down,
Yeah.
right.
And did you see that coming and said maybe this is a time to exit, or was it just opportunity, or just your?
I wanted to change direction. I got caught by the down market. I lost a little bit on the sale of my stuff, but I was able to catch the front end of other things with the money, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, as a dealer, some dealers don't learn this. I think they should. Is there's nothing wrong with taking a loss.
No, as a matter of fact, the longer you wait, the loss just gets bigger.
That's right. Same with collectors out there. If you've made mistakes, or if your tastes have changed, and now you have money and things that you just don't do it for you, if you're going to say, well, I have to at least get out what I paid into it, that's not the way to go about it. Take whatever your lumps are, and maybe they won't even be lumps, because you take that money and you reinvest into something that might be a better long-term, I don't use the word investment because I don't like to think of art in those terms, but I think it is smart to be able to take a loss. I take a loss all the time. Generally, it's something when I feel like I've had it too long, or I want something else, and I just say, okay, I clearly overpaid, or I didn't find the market, or I just don't care, and I'm going to move into another object. And so you did that with your toys, and you took that and put it into other things that are,
And I like your reference to the fact that you can't view art as an investment.
That's right.
You have to get pleasure out of it, regardless of the economic numbers. You just have to get your value out of owning it and enjoying it.
Yeah. It's even you and I who are professionals, who make our living, our lives dedicated to buying and selling art, is still a struggle even then. And I don't even know if we look at it in those terms when we buy them. When I buy as a collector, and I'm still a collector, I don't care as much. I don't care. I have things that maybe should sell now, and I don't care if it goes down in value later. I just love the object. And I think that's when you're buying things, if you can have some kind of rapport, something with that object, then the money doesn't matter. It's the object, and then find the right home for it, because you're not going to live forever too.
Right.
And that's another thing you've done too. You've worked with different museums for collections as well. Even I'm sure you've probably donated things as well in your career, right, Bob?
Oh yeah, it's I think museums are important. We recently had a museum show at the Museum of Albuquerque on the Likia jewelry.
That was such a great show. And there's a book that is going to come out on that?
It's out.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And we encouraged them. They had no funds for the publishing of a book. And so I sat down with, I didn't sit down, but I spoke to Deb Slaney and Kathy Wright at the show, and I said, when's the catalog coming out? And they said, well, there's no plans for one. And I said, well, it's funding, correct? And she says, of course. I said, how many people do you think would fund your book? And she said, well, we have a few. I said, no, you have every donor.
Yeah, that's got a piece in that museum show.
And every one of those people, I would suggest giving you $500. And so they raised the capital, and they put out a really good reference book, something that our last reference was Oscar Branson.
Yeah, and this was a show. It was a not to miss show, quite frankly. It was so. If you did miss the show, now you can get that catalog. It's a book, probably, or is it a catalog?
It's a paperback.
And where is it? Where can they buy that?
Down at the Museum of Albuquerque.
Okay.
And
did UNM Press publish it, or did they publish it themselves? Yeah.
I don't know.
And it's called Likia. What's the Likia de Suke? What are they?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't remember, but
it's a book that I'm going to buy, which I didn't know.
Yeah.
But I've been waiting for somebody to reach out and say, okay, it's here and it's done. So now I know. So I'll let people know on that.
It's a great reference book.
And the other thing you're working on, you've been actively involved with ATATA for a long time. Mm-hmm. Tell us what's going on with that organization.
I think on the we have a lot of complicated legal issues that would make most people dizzy. There's different sides of the coins that some view the market for all ills of cultural property issues. And so rather than confuse people about all these issues, all I can say is that ATATA is very concerned about indigenous people, all peoples having the right to self-determination. So we support people telling us what's important to them.
Native people.
Yes.
Yeah.
For religious purposes. And we have changed our bylaws to protect the future. So we're on board for making sure that from this day forward into the future, the similar things don't happen. Our biggest concern is that we want to be treated fairly about those items that were collected under laws of the land at the time. And our government should assume the biggest this biggest fault for items leaving these communities because they had forced policies of assimilation, getting rid of their language, getting rid of their
Indian boarding schools.
Yes, make everyone mainline America. And so when these things were in place, which were perfectly accepted, many things left the reservation properly. They weren't stolen. Converted natives to Christianity, Mormonism, whatever it may be, no longer could have these things. So that's all we're working toward, is these laws be fair in recognizing how things why they are the way they are. But ultimately, we're on board.
Yeah, and the tribal arts community, this is what the ATATA refers to, and I guess it's potentially maybe called the Authentic Tribal Arts Dealers Association. And basically, it's a group of people, like-minded people, that want to follow certain rules and regulations of what can and cannot be sold, what is appropriate and not appropriate to be sold when it comes to native arts, and especially things that are antique native arts. So, and the group wants to try to work with different tribes to figure out what should and shouldn't be sold and using their input clearly. So it's a way also as a buyer, if you're buying from individuals that are part of this group, you can be assured that you actually have authentic pieces and that come with ethics as well. So, I think it's a good organization that continues to grow and expand and evolve as time goes. And as laws change, things change. Everything changes in the world.
And then one last thing your visitors should understand is that TADA has a voluntary return program that we have given over 120 ceremonial objects back. And that program is by far more successful than anything promoted by the United States government.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful thing. So if you might be one of those individuals that has something you're not really clear whether this should be sold or not, you could always contact an Atata person like a Bob Gallegos and say, okay, we don't know, maybe you have some ideas, and if we feel like it was something that should be given back, can put you in touch with the tribes that would be most appropriate for that. So, and you need to have someone out there who has knowledge, information, and the connections with different tribes to be able to repatriate, so to speak, on certain objects that are clearly shouldn't probably have ever been sold, but now can find a way home. So that, which is a wonderful thing.
Yes.
So anything else you want to tell me, Bob Gallegos, that I haven't heard or learned or?
No, I think the business is good for a number of years to come. You have to change with the different buying habits, but the elements that make us love this business are still out there.
That's right.
And you just have to change. And so I'm 72 years old, and I don't ever plan to not work.
Yeah, and I think that's true for almost every
Right.
dealer I know, whether it's Native American arts or paintings. You love this material. You start when you're a kid. You love it. You're a collector. You want these things. You want the rest of the world to kind of catch on and figure it out. This is some of the most native arts, I think, are some of the most beautiful arts, both things that were early and contemporary. And as you'll notice, most of the people that I interview for this podcast that are in the antique tribal arts, they also know Native artists that are working today. They buy Native artwork. They promote Native artwork. So there is a continuum, and it's not just you're either this or that. It's a continuum, and I think of all people, we are some of the most concerned of Native causes, Native rights, and we want them to proceed, and of all people, we love the art. I mean, we've donated our lives to buying the art and promoting the art.
And I'm glad you ended it on that note, because it's so true. A lot of us get tied up in our daily making the bills and what have you, but when you step back and look at it, I mean, we're doing it not only because we can maybe make a little money at it, we're doing it for what you said, is we love the art, and we don't want to stand in the way of communities getting things back that they need. We actually support them. And I think so many, if you go on some of the contemporary social media platforms, you'll see a lot of criticism for anyone that deals in the art, because it becomes an issue of colonialism, appropriation, and a lot of that's true, but that's not what we're part of.
That's right.
We go forward. We're trying to protect the future and be respectful. So.
Yep, and I think we will be.
Yeah.
So Bob Gallegos, thank you. It's been a pleasure to spend a little time with you. Now I know you're also Dene. I had no idea.
That's right.
That's fantastic.
Well, thank you.
All right, very good. Bob Gallegos, Art Dealer Diaries.